Okay, so today Lola and I are doing another episode of Devon Bykes. Today we are covering the North Rampart Street murder house, the murder of Addie Hall. This murder happened in 2006, very shortly after Hurricane Katrina. The reason I wanted to do this particular crime is I've always been really interested in it. I remember when it happened, I was 14, so I was still really young. But I do remember my mom telling me about it and it being advertised as a boyfriend who killed his girlfriend and then ate her. Actually, that didn't happen. He actually never ate her. So he did cook her, though. But anyway, this was just always a really fascinating and scary and creepy story that I wanted to definitely dive into and learn even more about. So I do have a lot more locations that I go to compared to last week. I hope it's going to be a lot better than last week. There's a lot more variety in what you see. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Bye. Frenchman's a really great strip of little bars and restaurants. It definitely has a lot more jazz type of music, very low key. It's a great atmosphere right on the edge of the French Quarter and Marigny and Bywater. This is the Spotted Cat Music Club where Addie was a bartender. She was known by her friends as very happy, artistic, very strong-willed. She did happen to drink a lot, and sometimes that could lead to mean behavior that escalated. So this is Frenchman Street, which is right on the edge of the quarter going into the Marigny and Bywater areas. So it's actually on the opposite side of the North Rampart Street house. This is the bar that Zach worked at. I believe it's pronounced Buffa's, where he was a bartender. Again, right on the edge of the quarter, not very far from the Spotted Cat. So this again is on the opposite side of the North Rampart Street where they lived. So I'm on the corner of Burgundy and Esplanade, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Zach and his background before the murder took place. So he was a transplant from California, and he had lived here for several years. He decided to join the military before 9/11, the 2001 terrorist attacks. And he really didn't realize what he was going to get himself into. He got deployed to Iraq, and that ended up being very overwhelming for him, much like it did a lot of other people in the military. And he dealt with seeing murder, and he saw a young girl get killed that he had befriended, and he had a very difficult time handling that. He was known to be very calm and friendly and easygoing. The military can be a very intense environment for anyone. So that was definitely not the best place for him, even though he very much excelled in the military. It was, I think, the death that really got him down, which was very ironic. But so he lives in New Orleans, and he unfortunately did not have access to health care because he was not honorably discharged. He was generally discharged from the military because he was starting to not do so well on his health exams and physicals, and I read in several sources that he intentionally failed them. So that became problematic, which, I would say, in 2001, PTSD was definitely not something that was as talked about and familiar with people as it is now. And so he was suffering from that and didn't have access to health care. So he, could have gotten a lot of really good psychological evaluations and the help that he needed. But that was just not, unfortunately, not able to be a priority for him. And that led him down to a really negative path. He also did not have access to a GI Bill for his education, so he started working at a bar and really had to start from the bottom to get to the top of bartender. And we'll go more into what that atmosphere was like, not only for him but also for Addie. Okay, so let's address how Addie and Zach actually met. So because of their close proximity to their bars, they met through connections of other people and where they were. And so they began a relationship, and it started out really well. But if you look at the two individually, you can see that there would definitely be some problems. The fact that her friends had said that she had a string of different abusive relationships in her past, she tended to gravitate towards people like that, that were abusive, possibly because of some negative experiences in her childhood. And then you look at Zach as an individual, knowing what we know about his PTSD, his negativity in the military, and combining those two types of personalities, it can be very catastrophic depending on how they go about it. Both of them were bartenders. Both of them were in an environment where alcohol was very accessible. You also factor in the city of New Orleans, where alcohol and drinking and partying is very acceptable, all in moderation. But they were, just confined in those environments and really fed into that. And that's where problems start to arise. And then it leads to the murder of Addie Hall. So I'm on that corner of Burgundy and St. Anne, which doesn't have any geographical significance to the crime, but it is in the quarter, and it is very close to North Rampart Street, which is where the murder did take place. So let's add the context of Hurricane Katrina, because this crime happened in 2006, and right before Addie Hall was murdered, Zach and Addie were really flourishing during the time of Katrina. So let's go into, Katrina has a story all of its own. That's for another episode. But what I can add is that it was a very difficult time for people in the city of New Orleans, as well as a lot of other places. But specifically in New Orleans, a lot of the people did not anticipate how bad the storm was going to be and the negative effects of it. When you're told so many times that there's going to be a big storm and you need to evacuate, and then nothing really happens, then people just really stop believing in it. And some people didn't have access to get out of the city. Some people just wanted to choose to stay. So there's very much a variety of reasons. I couldn't find any information as to why Addie and Zach wanted to ride out the storm, but they did, and they had a much different experience from a lot of other people. So Addie and Zach, like I said, they really had a different experience from a lot of other people. What was in the media is that a lot of people were put out of their homes because of the flooding. They obviously didn't have electricity for a long time. There were issues with FEMA and the government providing what was needed. But Addie and Zach, they really, again, flourished in this environment. They had a lot of community around them. They were very positive. It's as if they were in their element. And so some different examples, they would give out drinks or food to people that passed by. There was an article, I believe it was in the New York Post, that came and interviewed different people to see what was going on post Katrina. And they interviewed Addie and Zach and Addie was known to flash the police, which there happened to be a lot more patrol in that area that they lived in, likely because of that. So they were very free-spirited and had a lot going for them that time, and that was a really positive time within their relationship. Okay, so post-Katrina, once things started to get back to normal, that is when they started having some problems in their relationship, which is really ironic to me, just because so many other people really suffered and struggled during Hurricane Katrina and the after effects of it, whereas they really were strong. And then once things got back to normal, as far as like them being able to work, getting back into the swing of things, going back into normalcy, it's as if they, didn't want to go back. It's as if they were living in this kind of fantasy world where they were alone in New Orleans, and, they were very much powerful duo within their own community. And so that's when things started to get a lot worse as far as the drinking. They became involved in drugs, which, always leads to problems. And then that's when more fights ensued, which led to the day in October that happened. So let's add some context about, their prior experiences, and then lumping on the alcohol, the drugs, and how that can create problems, and also what it's like to live in a city like New Orleans when you're suffering from something like that. So again, recap. Zach is discharged from the military, has PTSD, again, is not getting the right psychological support for it. He is bartending. Addie is in recap on her. She has had a string of abusive relationships, which can really show a lack of self-confidence and lack of self-worth. She was also a bartender, and that is where some issues started. I was also looking into different facts as to, about bartenders. Although I really enjoy going to bars, I don't know a ton about the culture and what it's like to work somewhere like that. It can be a very stressful environment. You are surrounded around temptation. You are in a very lax environment a lot of the time because of, drinking, but also you're in a high pressure atmosphere. You're working really late hours. You're working around people that might be dabbling in things that you happen to get involved in. So you have to be a very strong-willed person to not let it overtake you, and that can be really hard for a lot of people. And then if you also add in the fact that it doesn't pay that great, it can, depending on where you work, how long you've worked there, how good of a bartender you are, or waitress you are, anything in the restaurant industry. So adding on the stress of like, how am I going to pay the bills, and this inconsistent pay that you're not really guaranteed. If we apply that to what's going on with COVID-19 right now, it's really scary. Right, this is Royal Street, which is in the French Quarter. It has like a lot of variety of things, a lot of antique shops I've noticed, a lot of stores, kind of ritzy, has different restaurants, bars, but it's a little bit more upscale than something like Bourbon. But yeah, it's a really cool little strip, very clean, as clean as the French Quarter can be. And we're going to go to the Omni Royal Hotel, because that is where Zach jumped off and committed suicide. Okay, so behind me is the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel, which that was the last place that Zach was alive. He decided to jump off, side of the building, where he ended up landing on the roof of the parking lot. I believe that's what it was. That's where he was found. And so police found Zach with a letter in his pocket, is along with dog tags for identification, and he confessed to the murder of Addie Hall. October 17th, 2006 was the day that Zach committed suicide from the top of the Omni Hotel, which is right behind me. It's where he spent his last moments. There was some surveillance footage of him kind of going back and forth from jumping or not jumping. He did eventually jump, and he also did die on impact. Once police found him, they found a pair of dog tags, which helped identify him, as well as a letter to the police claiming that he had killed his girlfriend Addie, and to send a police car to 826 North Rampart Street. The note was very ominous. It said something along the lines of, I had to give my life for the one that I took, which was in reference to Addie Hall. Before Zach committed suicide, he spent a little over a week just kind of running through all of the money that remained. Once he killed Addie, I think he kind of knew it was over, and so he, in the journal entry that he left for police to read for his confession, he claimed that he spent his money on good food, good women, good bars, and just lived it up, I guess, in his final moments, high and drunk and with women, and then he ended up killing himself. So I'm right across the street from 826 North Rampart Street, which is where the murder of Addie Hall took place. This was the apartment that they lived in. The bottom section was the Voodoo Temple, whereas the top part of the apartment where you see the windows are, that was where their apartment was, and they lived above there. In September 2006, Addie and Zach were evicted from their previous apartment. I'm not sure where it was located, but it was somewhere in the French Quarter. I read that Addie had pulled a gun on someone, whereas Zach I believe she was arrested, whereas Zach had a drug-related charge, making him arrested. Not sure if that's the reason for why they were evicted, but regardless, they were evicted, and this is where their residence was next. They did sign the lease together, and then we're going to get into the issues and the crime that took place. So I mentioned that there was a voodoo spiritual temple in the street level portion of the house. Let's get into a little bit of the context of voodoo and how that kind of played a role in this crime, or actually how it, in my opinion, didn't play a role in this crime. So there's very much a misconception about voodoo and the practices of it. It is a religion. It's a very complex religion. I certainly am no expert on it. I was learning a little bit about it to better understand the case. But from what I understood about this particular temple that was there, it did relocate to another part of the quarter. But from my understanding, it was a place to learn more about voodoo, how it could be a positive. So, this is not something that was about ghosts and, bad, weird things, I guess, that can be stereotyped about voodoo. So we will get into a little bit about how the fact that some people believe that played a role, but I'm going to tell you what my opinion is on the matter later on. Okay, so Addie and Zach were continuing to have a volatile relationship in 2006. It was just getting worse and worse. So Addie believed that Zach cheated on her, and that was just really the last straw. She goes to her landlord at this apartment on October 4th, 2006, and she wanted to get his name removed from off of the lease, and she wanted to essentially kick him out because she was just done over it. Her landlord suggested that she try to work it out with Zach and did not comply with allowing her to remove his name. A couple days later, that is when the crime happened. So after police find the body of Zach, they go to this address because that's what was left in the letter, and they go into the apartment, and they notice right away something very odd and strange. The fact that the air conditioning was on, and it was 60 degrees. It was very cold. And we'll get into why it was so cold. And they noticed that there were different things spray painted on the walls. One of the things was "I'm a failure," written by Zach, and then also another thing led them to where they were going to find Addie's body. Before I get into this section of the crime and the remains of Addie Hall, I do want to say that it is very graphic. So if you are someone who's easily squeamish or you just don't like gory details, you might want to skip ahead. And about maybe 30 or 40 seconds after this, just wanted to give a heads up. Okay, so police find a couple things in the kitchen, and that's primarily in my opinion, the creepiest part of this apartment. So on the stovetop, there are a couple of pots. In one of the pots, there is a charred and burned decapitated head, which was unrecognizable. In another pot, there were cooked hands and feet in the oven. There were, in a pan, there were legs, arms that had also been cooked. And then they opened the refrigerator in a large plastic bag. They saw that there was a torso that was clearly a female's torso. They also found a journal that belonged to Addie. Zach actually entered the last entry as part of his confession for murdering her. Okay, so let's get into the entry that Zach did leave. I'm going to give you a pretty brief summary on what happened as far as how he committed the murder. So he wrote on Thursday, October 5th, he killed her at 1 a.m. He said that he strangled her. It was very quick, all right, implying that it was painless. Really, in my opinion, being very insensitive to the fact that he killed her. It's almost as if he was saying that it was really quick, so it was okay. That's my interpretation. So anyway, he strangles her, and I read several different sources that said that he slept next to the body that night, also performed sexual acts on it, and then left and went to work the next day as if everything was normal. Once he got back home, that's when he knew that he needed to get rid of the body, and he felt that the best way to do that was to dismember it. So he, took it into the bathroom in the bathtub, used a knife and hacksaw to dismember Addie Hall's body, and he also needed a way to dispose of it as discreetly as possible. So he thought the best method would be to cook the body, and therefore that's where her remains were and why they were found in the kitchen. Just like everybody to also reflect for a moment the physical strength that it must have, not even getting into the emotional aspect of it, but the physical strength that it would have taken for someone to do something like that. The mental capabilities where he was able to do something like that, and how just completely inhuman it was that he kills his girlfriend and then takes her body apart and cooks it. So it is really disturbing. A lot of media, once they got wind of this case, that was very much advertised that he was a cannibal and he ate her, and that actually, from everything I found, that was not the case. He did cook her, but once they examined his body in the autopsy, they did not find any human remains. So that, I guess if you're going to find somewhat of a silver lining, that is a very small one. Yeah. So you probably noticed a sign on the building and what it's being used for now. So there's actually a voodoo queen that is using the property as a museum, and I believe she's preserved the crime scene as closely as it can be. When I was doing some research on it, I did find that there were some images in regard to the museum, like if you wanted to visit it. And there were a lot of like dolls and creepy things, like I feel like props that you would find in a movie, and just kind of silly things that to me make it a lot more gimmicky, and it's kind of hard to take seriously. Now, I would be open to going on a tour just to go in the building. I gotta be honest, it creeps me out though. It even creeps me out just kind of standing in so close next to it, because you do know what happened there in the apartment. But to me, I don't think you need all of that stuff. I think the murder itself and the fact that a person was capable of doing that to somebody that they supposedly love, I think that's scary enough. There were also some TV shows that did some paranormal type episodes at this particular crime scene, and claimed that there was paranormal activity and ghost activity and strange things like that. Again, I didn't really do a lot of focus on that for this. I wanted to focus on the crime itself, because again, that is a lot more terrifying than a ghost. That being said, I hope one does not follow me home today and terrorizes me, because I'm home a lot because of COVID-19. Alright, so this is Bourbon Street. It's definitely the most famous street in New Orleans. Can be a lot of fun. I'm not going to go too much into the history of it. There are tons of bars, quite a variety. Very different looking from how it normally is. Perfect for a bike ride. So this is Bourbon Street. I'm now on Bourbon Street, which this is a very interesting thing that I found about the case that happened several years afterwards. So again, the crime happened in 2006, and they did, the media did a lot of different interviews with people that knew the couple, including one woman called Margaret Sanchez. She was really good friends with Addie. She went on to describe the two as like very likable people. They did have a very volatile relationship, but she was very surprised as to what happened. So fast forward to 2012. Margaret Sanchez and her boyfriend, they are on Bourbon Street, and they meet a Bourbon Street dancer, and Margaret and her boyfriend convinced the dancer to go with them somewhere private so that I guess they could do other things. So anyway, they convince her of this, and what ends up happening is they stab her in the heart and kill her, and actually dismember her very much like Addie. The body of the Bourbon Street dancer washes up on the Mississippi coast, and the police eventually track down Margaret Sanchez and her boyfriend. Margaret Sanchez, I believe in 2016, ended up confessing to the murder, and so that was a really bizarre connection, just because her friend died in a very similar manner, and that she ended up doing the same thing. So that was something new that I learned about this case, and I just thought it'd be really fascinating to share. Okay, so final thoughts on this bike tour. I really did a lot more research compared to last week. It took me a lot longer to compile everything. I used a huge variety of sources. There was just so much more out there about this crime, which was really great. I am listing those sources that I used below in the YouTube link. As far as like anything new I learned, I did learn some new pieces about it, but I had kind of heavily looked into this case before, just because it was so fascinating to me. If you know me, like I have this really big fascination with learning about true crime, specifically serial killers. Don't know why, I've just kind of developed that in the last 10 years. But anyway, I did learn actually a lot about more so the individuals of Addie and Zach. Him having PTSD, as well as a problem with alcohol, and Addie as well. And I think when you combine those two things, it can be very complicated and end up very badly. In this particular case, it did. Knowing what I know about killers like Ted Bundy or BTK, who, in my opinion, are just like evil from the inside, based on how they're wired, nature and nurture, or nature versus nurture. Anyway, I think that Zach definitely made some really bad choices, and he definitely did do an evil thing, and that does not take away from the fact that he did murder Addie Hall. Do I think that if he had received proper health and gotten help that he needed to recover from the war, and also maybe not been in a bar environment for somebody like him, yeah, I don't see somebody like that committing that type of crime. However, I also don't know as much about him as I do Ted Bundy or BTK. So, there's also something to be said for that. So I really did enjoy doing this case. This is definitely one of my favorites in New Orleans. I'm glad I got to cover it. It was very challenging, but really interesting. I hope you enjoyed it as well, and look for another video next Saturday. Thanks.